Hello. A fireball in Beirut as more Israeli bombs fall from the sky. A warning from the Prime Minister about the risk of all-out war and what it might mean at home and abroad. The anniversary of the hideous October the 7th attacks on Israel look set to be marked with more violence and more people on the move. We'll hear from Israel's ambassador to the UK this morning and the view from Lebanon and Iran. But with me here in the studio is the Cabinet Minister, Peter Kyle. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
It seems everybody everywhere is waiting to see what Israel's next move is and how and when they'll strike Iran.
They are. And of course, we're urging as much restraint as is possible. We shouldn't have any actions that are going to prohibit the movement to a ceasefire, to create the space for the political solution that can only end this conflict. OK, we'll talk more about that with you later, and also the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, who will join us too. And importantly, we will hear from some of the innocent civilians who've been caught up in this deadly mess right across the Middle East, including the mother of one of the hostages who was snatched 12 months ago.
You're thinking, how is he coping for so many months? If he's getting food to eat, if he's getting medicine or whatever, it's something that is not something that I can comprehend.
And our team at the desk for the next hour this week, Zani Minton-Beddoes, the editor of The Economist, Zara Sultana, formerly a Labour MP, now an independent MP, and Malcolm Rifkind, who was the Conservative Foreign Secretary. Thanks all for being with us this morning. Anna, good morning to you. We are focusing on the war in the Middle East today. It can feel bewildering, but we're going to take you through what's going on and why it matters. We can show you Beirut, the Lebanese capital. It's been hit again overnight and this morning as well by Israel. Israel's going after the group Hezbollah that the UK government describes as a terror group. Then let's take you to the front pages of the papers. There's so much news around this morning. The Sunday People splashes on what it calls the last flight out of hell. That is the last government chartered plane from Lebanon bringing Brits home. It's leaving today. Keir Starmer's then warning in the Sunday Times that the conflict in the Middle East might deepen divisions between communities here at home. And the Eye splashes on the risk of an all-out war. But the Sunday Express has a different story. The risk it claims to the Falklands after the government decided to give up the Chagos Islands. That's denied by ministers, but it's caused a lot of chatter. Let's turn first of all to our panel then. Now, Zani, this is a very complicated jigsaw. We're going to try and break it down for everybody watching this morning. But it seems, as we were hearing from Peter Kyle, the real moment now is what does Israel do to retaliate against the Iranian attacks?
I think that's absolutely right. Israel has promised a strong response. The Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has clearly been itching to give a strong response. The question is just how big will it be? Will there be an Israeli attack on the nuclear sites? Will there be an Israeli attack on oil terminals? Or will it be something less than that? And I think the real question now is whether the US can restrain the Israelis from doing something really dramatic and precipitating all-out war.
But, Sir Malcolm, in the last 12 months, we've had America and the UK continually urge restraint on Israel, and it hasn't worked in many people's views.
No, that's right, because Israel, like any other country, ultimately will determine its own vital national interests, as we would, as other countries would, even if that means disagreeing with the United States. But on the points that have just been made about how the Israelis might react, none of us know. So what I say has to be speculative. But my guess is, in this respect, the American position is actually important on nuclear, because I judge, and what I hear, is that the Israelis by themselves simply do not have the military capability.
So if America's saying no, don't
Well,
go
if the Americans are not going to be
nuclear.
involved, that's the more crucial point. It's not that they're saying no. In order to have any chance of seriously destroying or damaging Iran's nuclear installations, which are all deeply embedded in mountains and hills, you would have to have, first of all, the kind of bombs the Israelis don't have, but the Americans do. And secondly, one night of strikes would not have much difference. So they might do something symbolically, but that's all they could do if they don't have American support.
Well, in a few minutes, we'll hear how the Israeli ambassador here answered the question of what their plans were going to be. But Zara, you've long campaigned for Palestinian rights. We've spoken to you a few times in the last months about the situation in Gaza. But what do you make of what we're now seeing in Lebanon?
It is absolutely frightening. What we're seeing in Lebanon is the playbook that was used in Gaza, where homes, hospitals and civilian infrastructure is labelled as legitimate targets. That's what Netanyahu did at the UN. He basically legitimised an attack on Beirut before the bombs even fell. What we're seeing is 1 million people displaced. We're seeing 2,000 people already die from the bombs that have dropped on them in Beirut. And it's frightening because we could have stopped this much earlier by pursuing a ceasefire, by stopping arms sales. And actually what we see is a failure of Western diplomacy from the 12 months of a genocidal assault on Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon and the airstrikes from Iran.
OK, well, there's a lot of strong feelings in this situation always, and a lot of very urgent questions for leaders right across the region, as well as in the UK and the US. We'll be back with you a bit later in the programme. Let's just remind you then how these last brutal 12 months have turned the lives of thousands of ordinary families across the Middle East upside down. A year ago, tomorrow, Hamas, which many governments say is a terror group, crossed the border into Israel and killed more than 1,000 people and took more than 200 people hostage. The attacks, as you probably haven't been able to forget, began at a music festival where many young people had just gone to dance and have a good time. One of them was Alon Ohel, who was just 22 years old. I spoke to his mother, Edith, who hasn't heard from him since.
Sometimes it's really hard to breathe when you think about it. Like, I don't know, if he's in the tunnels, you're thinking, how is he coping for so many months? If he's getting food to eat, if he's getting medicine or whatever, it's something that is not something that I can comprehend. As a mother, you have to look out for your kids and you have to make sure that they are safe. So in my situation, it's a heartbreaking thing. I wake up every morning doing everything I can to bring him home before I go back to sleep or at night. I think, have I did everything I could? And sometimes it's very hard to answer those questions.
Can you tell us then something about him? What kind of young man is he?
Well, he loves life. He's like, his friends will say that he's the glue that glues them together. He's always laughing, always smiling. And he just loves people, and he gets really connected to people right away. He doesn't care about where you are from or what religion you are or what. He cares about your values, and as a family also, if we are in hardship or some friend feels, he's always there for them. He's always trying to help.
Do you think you'll see Alon again?
Oh, of course. I know I will see him again. I know this. I want it to be now.
Well, Israel's answer to those attacks, an invasion of Gaza and months of airstrikes on the territory run by Hamas, which crucially is backed by Iran, Israel's bitter adversary. Hamas says more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Now, journalists are not allowed in to find out what's really gone on, but I've been talking to Mahmoud Shalabi, who is an aid worker in northern Gaza.
The year has really been tough, to be honest with you. And I have lost loved ones. I've lost friends. And the sad thing is that we didn't even have time to mourn them, to feel sad about them. So we just buried them in a rush while all the drones were hovering above our heads, while there were tank shells being fired near us. And we just fled the scene. I now struggle to have water. I struggle to have electricity. I struggle, to go from one location to the other. There is no infrastructure. There are so many sorrows that I see on a daily basis when I walk in the streets. Everybody is overburdened. You don't see it, but you feel like everyone has a ton of sorrow hovering over their heads that could crash them at any given time. And I am really surprised how we are still functioning as humans during these dire situations.
And the conflict has spread to Lebanon now, from where Hezbollah, described by governments as a terror organisation, has been firing missiles into Israel for many months. But this week, Israeli troops have gone into Lebanon and been striking from the air, also killing the leaders of Hezbollah, which, like Hamas, is backed by Iran, Israel's bitter foe. And the strikes on Lebanon come after Iran launched nearly 200 missiles at Israel this week. Now, Lebanon says more than 1 million people have had to leave their homes. Now, last week we spoke to Brit Emma Bartholomew, who was trying to get back to the UK from Beirut. I'm pleased to tell you that she has made it home, which we thought you would want to know. But her best friend, Elliot, was the one who helped her leave. Elliot's still in Lebanon, and we spoke to him as the danger rises.
There is always a sense of fear and uncertainty about what's going to happen and where the escalation might reach. Refugees are still pouring in from the south. The Beirut schools, public schools, they are housing now most of the refugees, and they're full completely. We have a severe lack of supplies. The situation here cannot be sustained for long that way. Something has to happen.
You are amazingly calm and amazingly resilient, but what is your worst fear about what might happen in the next few months? We've seen what happened in Gaza. The situation in the Middle East does seem to be incredibly dangerous.
Well, my worst fear is exactly that what would happen in Gaza would happen here. We feel like we are a statistic, and we're just waiting for our number to come up, and this is not a good feeling. We want to feel like we belong to this world, and we want the world to fight for us, I guess.
Well, driving much of this are the bitter tensions between Iran and Israel. We'll be hearing from both today. First, I've been speaking to the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovely. I started by asking her about the October the 7th attacks last year.
That's been the hardest year for us as Israelis. Since Israel was established, we never experienced anything like that. We've seen wars, we've seen terror attacks, but never in our history we've seen so many Jews being slaughtered brutally, barbarically, like Hamas did at October 7th. Hamas terrorists shattered families, killed babies in their beds, killed children in their pajamas. This type of things we never believed that will happen in our country. And as you said, there is still this open wound of 101 hostages.
But many of the hostage families do not believe that the strategy that the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has adopted is the right one. They've been calling for ceasefires. They've been calling for a different approach to try to get their family members home.
I think it's quite clear that a terror organization is not playing by the rules of a democratic country. So Hamas is not interested in releasing these people. That's the main problem. So as you know, there was the Biden proposal. Since May, Israel agreed 3 different times, to 3 different proposals, more or less in the same framework. We wanted to release, first of all, the people that are still alive. That was the main goal of the government. I can completely understand that. We want to save lives. We don't want those people to be executed or tortured like they are in the hands of Hamas. And we wanted to make sure that all the people that are alive will be returned back home to their loved ones. And unfortunately, Hamas refused. So you need to understand that the government is not in a dilemma when we said yes and Hamas said no.
Let's talk then about events in recent days. So Israel has been targeting Hezbollah, seen as the UK government as a terror group, but in Lebanon. But 1 million people have now been displaced. Civilians are losing their lives. Health facilities have been hit. Why is it that Israel believes that the loss of civilian life is worth it?
I think we need some context here. Israel had no interest in any of those wars. We never wanted the war with Lebanon. We were in a situation that at the 8th of October, Hezbollah made a strategic decision to join Hamas as part of the ring of fire that Iran wanted to surround Israel through its proxies, and fired non-stop on Israeli civilians.
Many of your allies and many of our viewers worry that your response as a democracy has not been proportionate. Tens of thousands of civilians have lost their lives in Gaza. Now civilians in Lebanon are losing their lives too, and 1 million people have been displaced from their homes. When will you say enough?
We will say enough when our people will be safe. This is the only thing Israel is interested with. We want peace and quiet. We want 60,000 people being displaced from the northern cities that turn into ghost towns to return to their homes. And wait a second. I think just by speaking about civilians, you lose the context of why those civilians had to leave their homes. Because they had ammunition and rockets in their homes that Hezbollah used them as human shields. So you need to remember this is Hezbollah's fault that the south of Lebanon, by sitting on our border, not in compliance with 1701 UN resolution. So we're talking about UN resolution from 2006, full implementation of that. Hezbollah should be beyond the Litani River, not on our doorstep. Hezbollah was planning to do the same ground invasion that Hamas planned. Israel cannot afford another 7th of October.
But you say the UN there, you mentioned the UN resolution 1701 there. The UN has also said that what Israel's doing in the West Bank, for example, is a highly concerning pattern of the unlawful use of force. And our Prime Minister Keir Starmer has written today that a better future for Israel, which the UK wants, will not be won by traumatising and orphaning another generation. Does Benjamin Netanyahu not listen to allies calling for restraint?
We're listening to all our allies. We appreciate very much Britain's support.
Ignoring them?
Wait a second. We appreciate very much Britain's support. Britain is a great ally of Israel. But at the same time, what would Britain do if it was under 10,000 rockets non-stop? Can you imagine Liverpool and Manchester being abandoned for a year? I cannot imagine even 10 minutes that your Prime Minister would have allowed a rocket attack on your northern cities, people being evacuated, losing their homes, having no horizon to come back home. The Israeli government is doing the very basic thing that every government should do, to promise the people to live peacefully and safely in their homes.
Your leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has warned there will be a strike on Iran in some form after they attacked Israel a few days ago. Will you rule out attacking Iran's nuclear sites, which is what President Biden wants you to do?
I'll tell you what Israel is definite to do, to remove the threat. Iran attacked Israel twice, at the 14th of April, and just a few days ago, with hundreds and hundreds of missiles. Those missiles were targeting civilians. Those missiles could kill thousands of people if Israel didn't have such a good protective systems and at the same time very disciplined civilians that were in shelters. So we're not interested to be under a missile threat from Iran. We're not interested to be under this ring of fire from the proxies. This is why we will dismantle the threat. This is for the cabinet to decide how. But we will dismantle the threat because no country will tolerate that.
But could that include a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities? Because that would, perhaps you would acknowledge this, many Western leaders think that would move the whole world into a new phase of danger. President Biden has asked Israel to rule out attacking Iran's nuclear sites. Will you?
We will do everything that will remove a threat, first. Second, if the world wants to prevent something like that, first of all, we need to prevent from Iran nuclear abilities, because if this is what Iran is doing without nuclear abilities, can you imagine what this regime of terror, this regime that killed and executed Mahsa Amini, that doesn't care about our values, that is against any Western and liberal values. Can you imagine what this regime can do?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he wants this moment to bring about a change in the balance of power in the Middle East. What do you mean by that? What does he mean by that?
It's very simple. We realized at the 7th of October that we cannot live with a jihadi, genocidal terror organization on our doorstep, and we are making sure those terror organizations won't exist by eliminating their leaders, by making sure they won't have the infrastructure, by reducing the amount of missiles they have.
However many civilians get caught up in that mission?
This is not the way Israel is operating, Laura. Israel is making sure that every civilian will have enough time to get to a safe place.
This is simply hasn't happened in Gaza, Ambassador. That simply hasn't happened.
We moved the population in Gaza few times to very designated places with the UN aid. We operated in the best way that army can operate in a place was 100% using, in a cynical way, children and women by Hamas as human shields. This is Hamas creating this double war crime by using its own people as human shields. You cannot blame Israel for that. They used hospitals, kindergartens, civilian facilities as a big storage of rockets against Israel. So you cannot blame Israel for that. And Israel did so much to make sure the population in Gaza will be safe and will be out of harm.
Your allies are very concerned, however, that your response has not been proportionate, and your allies here in the UK and in the United States still believe in the long term the only way through this is a two-state solution for the Palestinian people to have a land of their own. Is that on the table?
Just think about Gaza as a good example. In 2005, Israel left Gaza to give them the opportunity to build statehood, to build better life. Some people said Gaza has the potential to be a Middle East Singapore. Look what they turned Gaza to, the big terror monster that attacked Israel at the 7th of October. So there is no trust between Israelis and Palestinians at the moment. People that attack you in your bed and slaughter and rape you, those not are the people that you want to say, let's reward you with a statehood.
But that's the activity of Hamas, which our government says is a terror group, not the activity of ordinary Palestinians living in Gaza.
Yes, but in order to have a better future on the horizon, Israel is interested in peace. We signed Abraham Accords, we signed peace with Egypt and Jordan. The problem is when the Palestinian people are hijacked with this radical genocidal ideology, you cannot start working this path before you'll have a better education in Gaza.
But does the path to peace involve Palestinians, in the end, having a land of their own?
The leadership of the Palestinians must recognize the right of Israel to exist. At the moment, unfortunately, you have a corrupted leadership in the Palestinian Authority alongside people that are supporting Hamas and Hamas' barbaric attack on the 7th of October. There is a long way to go.
Well, the Israeli ambassador speaking to me in the last hour. Well, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, like the United States, has been calling on all sides for restraint in this more and more dangerous situation. Peter Carroll, Cabinet Minister, the Science Secretary, is with us this morning. Let's start with what Israel might do next in terms of Iran. Does the UK government support Israel attacking Iran?
We're urging restraint. Now, Iran did fire hundreds of rockets into Israel recently. Israel does have the right to defend itself, but we do urge actions to be taken that are proportionate, but also will lead towards a de-escalation of the overall situation. Now, by Iran firing those rockets, they escalated the situation. That was a terrible situation for them to engage in. But we go back a year, and those interviews you gave at the beginning here with the hostage families were incredibly moving. We do understand deeply what Israel has suffered in this year, but the only way forward is restraint, a ceasefire to create the space for a political solution, because this is getting more complicated, the war is deepening, and it is not moving towards the peace that we need. So we are urging the steps that will take us towards that peaceful settlement.
And in terms of urging restraint, does that mean then you are saying as a government to Israel, do not attack Iranian nuclear sites?
We are working with our international allies. In the last few days, the Prime Minister has spoken to President Biden, to President Macron, to Chancellor Schulz. We are working in lockstep with our international allies. We can't instruct Israel as a sovereign state to do anything, but as key allies we can advise them, and the advice is very clear and it is unanimous from our international allies that we must exercise restraint in the region.
Does that mean then the implication of that, and the White House has suggested this, that means do not attack nuclear sites?
We are not giving operational instructions to Israel, but it is very clear from the words that I am using and the Prime Minister is using that actions that lead towards a restrained political solution based on a ceasefire, those actions, those outcomes do determine the actions that need to be taken that would lead towards it, and I think that speaks for itself.
Now, the UK has helped Israel on some of the occasions when it has defended itself from Iranian missiles, but would you rule out the UK military being involved in any way in any attacks on Iran?
These are operational decisions that must be taken.
That's a question of principle.
These are operational decisions that will be taken by the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister, and also the Foreign Secretary, These are delicate negotiations, delicate situations. Britain will do what it needs to do to support our allies in a time of need, but it is very clear from what we have said publicly that Britain will use all of its influence, all of the tools we have at our disposal to move towards a swift diplomatic solution based on a ceasefire as quickly as possible. Now, we're working very closely with our international allies. We will take actions in concert with our international allies.
There is no sign of a swift diplomatic resolution. You know, just in the last 10 days, diplomacy failed to stop attacks that were coming. And this is a question, for some people in your own party, this is a question of principle, that it's okay, in some people's view, for the UK to be supporting Israel when it's defending itself, for our jets to be in the air if there are missiles raining down on Tel Aviv. But it would not be acceptable for the UK military in any way to play a part in Israel attacking Iran. That's a question of principle. Would you be comfortable with the UK military helping Israel attack Iran?
We simply don't know the circumstances of what is happening, might or might not happen in the days ahead. And I think all of you viewers would understand why I'm not going to get involved in operational circumstances for an action that may or may not happen, and we don't know the details of in the days ahead. These are decisions that I've been in these rooms when the Prime Minister has been leading through times of difficulty in the short time that our government has been in office. And I can tell you that our Prime Minister acts with real steadfastness, thoughtfulness, and deep consideration for the rule of domestic and international law. That will guide all of the decisions that this government takes.
We know that the last government chartered plane from Lebanon to bring Brits home is leaving today. After that, are you poised to use the UK military to get people out?
Well, we've already laid on 3 flights which have brought people out. There's a 4th one leaving today. And we're on standby. If the demand is there, we will use whatever is needed, whether it's more chartered flights or whether it's the military. We are ready to do what is needed to be done. But the vast bulk of people who have requested to leave, we have managed to deal with. So I pay huge tribute to our diplomatic services in Lebanon and in the region, but also the Foreign Office, who have done this in a really steadfast way, as not as part of a sort of last-minute crisis. We've been preparing for this for some time, and you can see that the actions that we've taken have worked really, really well.
And we should also remind people of practical advice. If they have family there or they are there, they must register with the Foreign Office, and they can do that online to make sure that there's help there for them if they need it. It's interesting, though, this morning, the Prime Minister has written in the Sunday Times not just about urging restraint in the region, but about the impact that this conflict has already had and may have on tensions in this country. Now, at protests yesterday, and we can show our viewers some of the images this morning, there were people carrying placards, backing, even saying that they loved Hezbollah, which the government says is a terror group, which has been behind many of these attacks on Israel. Those divisions are here. What are you going to do about that?
It's true. When there is conflict in the Middle East, divisions emerge elsewhere around the world. We see that here in our own country. Yesterday in the protests, there was a lot of peaceful protests, but there were people who were carrying signs as the one that you just described. That is a criminal act. Supporting a prescribed terrorist organisation such as Hezbollah is a criminal act. We, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, said very clearly yesterday that the police have our full support should they take action against people carrying signs like that.
But what's the concern that Keir Starmer's getting at when he warns about things getting worse here, about this conflict being felt in this country? We know, from a political point of view, Labour lost a lot of support, even lost some of its constituencies to a handful of pro-Palestinian rights independent candidates. I mean, what is his fear? There
are people, throughout this country who have lived experience or connections to different parts of the different sides on the conflict, and it's a complex conflict. It's complex in the Middle East, in the region, and therefore it is complex in this country. Now, we've just come from a period with the previous government that used division as a tool for political advancement. We are, as a government, striving to bring communities back together again. It is extremely difficult when there are issues which are the issues in the Middle East, and the war is deepening, for us to do that and achieve it here. So I think what Keir and what the Prime Minister has done is been really honest about the fact that there are communities in this country who feel deeply aligned for lots of different reasons to different participants in the war in the Middle East, and we do not want that to fall out into divisions within our own country between different British communities, different British citizens, sometimes different communities within neighbourhoods. So we're doing everything we can by reinvesting in community support, doing everything we can from leadership, from the top with the Prime Minister, to use a language that unites our country. Where there is acts which fall into support for terror organisations, we will act swiftly. We will act absolutely with the full force of the law to make sure that that doesn't become the norm in this country. But where there is just activity which is divisive, where hate can come into community relations, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to take that language and that behaviour out of local discourse and the way that we deal with issues as a country.
Okay. There's so many things that we'd have liked to talk to you about, and we'll look forward to having you back another time to talk more about what's going on in your Department of Science and Technology. But just as you're here, you'll know that we have talked a lot on this programme about the safety of children online, and we've talked to lots of families who've spoken very movingly about their own experiences. Now, we know that there is a new bit of law, the Online Safety Bill. The regulator, Ofcom, is consulting on exactly how the new rules are going to work. But will you commit to use your power to get the regulator to fill in some of the loopholes that campaigners for kids and digital safety experts have already identified? For example, the rules as they stand would allow unknown adults to ask their kids to be a friend online, to send friend requests. Now, that's just one example, but as the Secretary of State, you have the power to tell Ofcom to fill in those gaps that some people, campaigners, are already worried about. Will you do that?
I've already exercised those powers since I was appointed just 3 months ago in several other areas. And yes, I'm looking at all of those loopholes and I'll close it. I really hope I can come back on the show and talk about all of the opportunities we have if we get technology and the harnessing of the digital world that we're moving towards right. We can only exploit those opportunities if we get safety right at the beginning. I'm looking at all the international evidence at the moment because, you know, some countries like Australia are moving towards a ban for mobile phones. I'm open-minded about how we keep kids safe and young people safe, particularly those with vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And I'm trying to look at ways I can build evidence. One of my frustrations with the tech sector is that they haven't invested in real evidence about the impact their products have on young people. And they are the only sector I can think of in society that can release products into society without proving they're safe before release. So just a couple of weeks ago, I exercised my powers to get intimate image abuse, you know, what's called revenge porn, from being a problem. So now they have to prove algorithms drive that behaviour away before they come online. And if they do come online, they must act swiftly when it's brought to their attention. Otherwise, they'll face very heavy fines. So these are creative uses of the powers that I have to try and make sure safety is there at the start, not us picking up the pieces afterwards. And increasingly, you're going to see this government working with the US and our partners abroad to make sure that safety is proven before the release of products. That's where we need to get to.
Okay, really interesting. Well, do come back and talk to us another time about that because we know the audience really is interested. Thanks very much indeed, Peter Carroll, for speaking to us this morning. Well, what did you think of that? What do you think about what's going on in the Middle East? You can let us know. Email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on social media. You can use the hashtag #BBCLauraK. You know, we love to hear what is on your mind, and we might share some of the conversation later in the show or in our newsletter later in the week. So let's come to our panel then. Zani, firstly to you, what did you think of what we heard from the Israeli ambassador and how she was defending their actions in recent weeks?
So when I listen to the Israeli ambassador, I have a lot of sympathy with Israelis' desire and need for security. I've been to Israel twice since October 7th. I've been to the kibbutz. One of the kibbutzes right 700 meters from Gaza. I've heard the stories and seen what happened there, and it was horrific. So I totally understand that Israel is a traumatized country, a country whose citizens desperately value their security. Where I disagree with her, where I part company with her, is the means to achieve that. I also went into Gaza. As you said earlier, you can't go into Gaza independently, so I went into Gaza with the Israeli army. But even with the Israeli army, and even across to the Mediterranean Sea, what's called the Netzarim corridor, in an armored vehicle, and then was on the beach, you can see that this place is totally devastated. I literally didn't see a single building that hadn't been devastated. And that is no way to build the future of Gaza. You've got, as Zara said, you've got 2 million people who've been, 70% of whose houses have been destroyed. There are people starving. There are people completely suffering. And so you have to find a way to move to a political solution. You have to find a way to rebuild Gaza. And my worry is that the Israelis are now beginning to do the same in Lebanon that they have done in Gaza. That's the real concern. And so I just don't think, I understand the need for security. I am with them when they want to degrade terrorist organizations, be it Hamas or be it Hezbollah. But violence will only get you so far. I thought it was very telling when she said, we will say enough when our people will be safe. Well, Israelis won't be safe unless there is the means to a political solution.
Zara, when you listen to the government minister, Peter Kyle, then your former colleague in the Labour Party, try to carefully step through this sort of sensitive issue, do you think on the left that people would, how do you think they would view the UK government getting involved with an attack on Iran?
It's absolutely unacceptable. There is no scenario where that can be justified. And I find it highly concerning that Peter Kyle couldn't rule out British involvement in military action. If we look at the past 2 decades of British foreign policy in the Middle East, there are catalogues of failures and clearly lessons haven't been learned. And when we look at what the British public think, 56% of the British public back an arms ban on weapons. Only 17% oppose that. 67% believe that Israel has committed war crimes, and 84% want Netanyahu arrested if he enters the UK. So clearly there's a detachment from British public opinion and what the government are saying.
And yet you're a strong supporter of Palestinian rights, except if you were, as we heard from the ambassador, an Israeli, as Zani was saying, do you understand that need, that desire for safety and protection for Israelis?
Often I get asked, do I believe in Israel's right to defend itself? And what we see is 42,000 people dead in Gaza, disproportionately women and children, a health infrastructure completely dismantled, every single university destroyed. That is not a country's right to defend itself. That is what the ICJ is putting Israel on trial for, charges of genocide against the Genocide Convention. They are 2 very different things. And in fact, the Israeli ambassador has rejected Palestinian statehood aspirations since 2013. She says, this land is ours, all of it is ours. She is trying to achieve global recognition for illegal West Bank settlement. She called the Nakba of 1948 an Arab lie. This is not a partner for peace.
You mentioned there lots of historical events, and Sir Malcolm, you know, as Foreign Secretary and as a long-serving cabinet minister, also you've seen many different Middle East crises come through. Where do you think the solution might be here? Because listening to the Israeli ambassador, she doesn't see a solution being stopping this in any time soon. Listening to the other side, there is no sign that anybody on the other side would want to stop this anytime soon either.
You're quite right that a solution is not going to be soon. But what is needed, both from the Israelis and from the Palestinians, is leadership that is prepared not to forget the past, but to move on to a political dialogue and proposals once the military side of this has completed. Now, one thing is fundamentally changed compared to every previous crisis that Israel has faced. We have 4 Arab governments, the neighbors of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, who have established diplomatic relations with Israel, have recognized Israel, exchanged ambassadors, and who have not, they've criticized the way Israel has behaved in the last year, but they have not broken relations, as you might have expected, from Arab governments. Why have they done that? Partly because they loathe Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. We always say, according to the British government, they are terrorist organizations. You could also say the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, and the United Arab Emirates. But also because they share with Israel a loathing of the current regime in Iran. Because behind Hamas and Hezbollah, neither could operate but for the Iranian, not just political support, but the supply of weapons and the so-called strategy of using their proxies to impose maximum suffering on Israel.
And we are hoping in a second actually to speak to somebody, a politician in Iran, which is an unusual thing to do. So we're just trying to get the lines sorted to speak to them shortly. But Zani, just to you, also the editor of The Economist, as well as somebody covering foreign policy, there is also behind all of this, we've talked about the community effect here with Peter Kyle, but there is also, if this carries on, if this spirals out of control, the effect on everybody's wallets could be very significant, right, in terms of oil and the importance of the region. So what's the risk there?
Of course, if you have an all-out war between Iran and Israel, it could have very damaging consequences. It is worth noting that the price of oil is currently lower than it was on October 6th last year. So thus far, there has been really relatively little effect. There's been an impact on global shipping because the Houthis have been lobbing missiles, and so ships now have to go around Africa. But thus far, I think we haven't seen it. But you're right. If in the absolute worst case, you would have, not just a completely horrific war between Israel and Iran, but you would have global consequences. I think the question of absolutely paramount has to be avoiding that. And the key to that is really, I think, the United States. I mean, it's important, and what Peter Kyle said was important, and the UK does play a role, but the real player here is the US.
But with an election pending, I mean, it's Netanyahu. There is almost no sign that Netanyahu's been listening to the US in the last few months.
Well, absolutely. President Biden's in a bit of a no-win situation because he can't do anything other than really support Israel because of the risk that hurts him on November the 5th. At the same time, he's being really hurt in Michigan, which has a big Arab population and is a very close swing state. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is waiting for the results of this election, and I think is crossing his fingers that Donald Trump wins, because Donald Trump, just last week, said it was time to hit the nuclear sites.
And Zara, to you, it's interesting Keir Starmer's raising the risk to community relations here. And we've seen protests, we've seen also what happened in the general election. Is that something that you worry about?
In terms of community relations, I think often what is happening in the Middle East gets divided into binaries of its Muslim communities and its Jewish communities. What we see in the streets of London and across the country are communities of all backgrounds, of all ages, of all demographics coming together because they don't want to see UK complicity in war crimes that are taking place. This isn't about communities, and I understand that there has been a rise in Islamophobia and a rise in anti-Semitism, and we saw some of that play out over the riots in the summer. But when we kind of use that point, often it is to undermine legitimate grievances about war crimes.
But is it legitimate for people at a protest in London to be holding up a sign saying,
absolutely not, yeah. Absolutely not. And there are laws in place that will deal with that, but over 300,000 to 800,000 people attended yesterday's demonstration. And if we're going to use one or two figures, then I think that completely distorts the reality of the people that are taking part in these marches and what they're calling for.
Absolutely right to say that communities aren't solid blocks. All sorts of people have all sorts of different views, even in the same community. And just lastly to you, Sir Malcolm, having seen lots of these conflagrations over the years, do you have any optimism that it is fixable in any time that we might even vaguely describe as being soon or quickly?
Yes, I do, actually. And I'll tell you why, because I was the Foreign Secretary who committed the United Kingdom to a two-state solution way back in the 1990s. And I've never
Maybe they need you now.
I've never changed my view on that. But look at some of the other problems in the world that were thought to be unable to be solved. The Cold War ended without a shot being fired when Gorbachev and Reagan and Thatcher got to speak to each other. Apartheid in South Africa was dismantled by agreement, not just by Mandela, but de Klerk, the leader of the white South Africans. And think in Britain, when we had the IRA, for a whole generation, terrorists attacking people, that was solved. Now, the common bond between each of these three solutions was when each side, not one side, each side produced statesmen who were prepared not to forget the past, but to actually negotiate and make the compromises that are required. And these compromises are there to be made. They were almost made by Rabin and Arafat many years ago.
Politics and diplomacy can sometimes work. So there's a note of optimism from your experience of the past. Well, let's talk to Iran then. On Friday, Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that Iran would strike back against Israel again if necessary. We can now speak to Masumeh Ebtekar, who was a vice president in the Iranian cabinet in 2021. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Isn't Iran responsible for escalation by attacking Israel, funding Hezbollah and Hamas, which have both repeatedly attacked Israel?
Well, we have to look at the history of this region. This region was a calm region, a peace-loving region, people from different backgrounds, different religions, they're living together in all different countries in this region. But something happened. Something happened in 1948, and the creation of a state where for its existence, it had to expel the local community, the indigenous people there. And then we had refugees, we had thousands of people being expelled from their homes. And then then insecurity, instability ensued. It's not something that we just look at the recent events and analyze it. It's something that we have to look at the history.
And history cannot disappear, but yet we must talk about what is happening now. And Hezbollah, Hamas, both considered terror groups by many governments around the world, are being funded by Iran. And this week, your supreme leader said that Israel should be annihilated. So surely you must admit Iran bears some responsibility for what's going on.
It's our definition of what terrorism is. If a nation is legitimately defending its home, defending its existence, defending its security, it's not a terrorist, it's a resistance group. And this is where we have to make our definitions clear. We can't use double standards. We can't apply international regulations and norms whenever we like. But when a state like Israel has been undermining every single convention, every single international norm has been undermined in the past year by the Zionist entity. They have done everything which is contrary to the Human Rights Charter, to the Geneva Conventions. They have done
what about the
everything
activities of Hamas and Hezbollah? 12 months ago, Hamas killed more than 1,000 Israelis. They took more than 200 people hostage. Are you suggesting those actions were legitimate?
It didn't start on October 7th. Everyone knows that. It started way before.
That's not my question. I'm asking you if you would justify those appalling attacks where more than 1,000 people were killed by Hamas, more than 200 hostages were taken. Can you justify those activities?
Nobody justifies civilian deaths. But when it happens at the scale that it has happened in the past year against the people of Gaza, and now just in the past week against the people of Lebanon, we have over 2,000 civilians killed in Lebanon only in the past week. This is what we're speaking about. A nation, all the nations in this region, they are legitimately defending themselves. They're defending their independence, their integrity. They're defending their right to live.
But there are many people in your own country who are appalled by the actions of the Iranian regime, which is not a democracy, which locks up people who disagree with them. How can you be telling other countries?
Exactly. A lot of people are now demanding a serious change in the policies of Western governments. We saw yesterday was a national day of protest against the policies against the Palestinian people, and tens of thousands of people were marching in the US and many countries in Europe, including the UK. People are protesting. They're not satisfied with the policies of their government, and the solution is clear. If they
I think we've just lost the line to Tehran there, but that was us speaking to Massime Ebtekar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. So a glimpse of the thinking of Iranian politicians who are involved in funding, as we know, Hezbollah and Hamas, who are considered terror groups by many governments around the world, but interesting to hear the view from Iran. Now then, at the Tory conference in Birmingham this week, the Shadow Foreign Secretary told the conference that Israel did have the right to defend itself. But of course, there is concern in the Conservative Party, as among all Western politicians, about what is going on. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, joins us this morning. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now, we've spoken to the Lebanese, Israelis, and they're a glimpse from Tehran this morning. But what's your assessment of the situation? You know, when you were in Cabinet, you were International Development Secretary, you've seen many of these types of crises, but perhaps not one as dangerous as this?
Well, it is a very dangerous crisis in a world that in recent years has become more dangerous than at any time in our lifetime. But I think if you focus on what is happening in Lebanon, you see that Israel absolutely has the right of self-defense. No government would allow an internationally prescribed terrorist organization to sit there lobbing rockets over the border and moving its population, killing its population. More than 60,000 Israelis have had to move south. And the right approach is not a ceasefire, actually. The right approach is for Hezbollah and its Iranian masters to abide by United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 and pull back behind the Litani River. And that would end the conflict that's taking place in Lebanon. But as I say, the British government, imagine if the British government were in the position of the Israeli government. We would not stand for that. And Israel has the right of self-defense and is exercising that.
There is a sense at the moment that many people are holding their breath and wondering how Israel will retaliate against Iran, which we expect possibly in the next couple of days. We asked earlier, Peter Kyle, if the UK could or should be involved in any retaliation and help Israel in that attack. In your view, should the UK military help Israel in an attack on Iran?
Well, the UK military personnel and weapons have been helping Israel stop the incoming rockets on 2 occasions now.
But this is a different question.
That Iran has fired. I'm not going to second guess what the Prime Minister and the government will be doing and saying to Israel at the moment, but I would have thought that in view of what is happening in Lebanon, in view of what is happening in Gaza, it's right for a very strong position to be taken over defence of Israel, but I think we've got to move to what Sir Malcolm Rifkin described so well as the opportunity for people to lift their eyes towards peace. And I would just make this point that it was following the Intifada that we got to the Oslo Accords. Intifada, the darkest of days, we got to the Oslo Accords, which very nearly worked. And when the guns are silenced and finally this awful slaughter that we've seen over the last 12 months comes to an end, building on the Abraham Accords, there is a real opportunity now for the region to engage in a serious political dialogue which leads to a 2-state solution and to draw the poison that has caused such trouble both in the region and internationally.
And the Abraham Accords is the last time when there was anything like international agreement about how to go forward, really. But we heard from the Israeli ambassador, though, earlier today, who said, in her view, a 2-state solution essentially can't be on the table at the moment. And many Western leaders clearly, they might not say it publicly, but privately, their warnings and their urging of restraint to Netanyahu appears to have been falling on deaf ears. I mean, do you think that the Israeli government is listening to its allies at the moment?
Well, Britain is a staunch ally of Israel, but has also been a critical friend. The last Conservative government had strong discussions because of that friendship with Netanyahu. But the point I would make is that there will be a 2-state solution by definition at some point. Britain has made it clear, the last government made it clear, and so has this government, that we will recognise the Palestinian state, but at the right time, and it shouldn't be at the beginning of that process, which would look like a reward for the slaughter that was perpetrated just a year ago.
One of the impacts, of course, on all of this is the effect on ordinary civilians whose lives have been turned upside down. The UK is an important aid power. Of course, you used to be the International Development Secretary, but Robert Jenrick, who's one of the candidates who wants to be the leader of your party, has said the foreign aid budget is bloated. Is he right?
Well, if only it was bloated. We've seen an enormous amount of the aid budget going to pay for the first year of asylum seekers in Britain. That's absolutely within the rules, but it's an enormous amount of money. And Jeremy Hunt was persuaded to provide additional money to compensate for that. One of the key focuses at the upcoming budget is whether Rachel Reeves will provide a similar amount, because if she doesn't, then the effect on the lives of hundreds of thousands of children in the poorest parts of the world will be very bleak indeed.
So Robert Jenrick's wrong about that then?
Well, I understand what he's saying about the importance of increasing defence expenditure, but I'm afraid to describe the development budget as bloated is simply not true.
And that contest is running, it seems, small beer compared to the big issues we've been talking about this morning, but it is important, and our viewers are interested in who's going to be the next leader of the opposition in this country. The next round of voting among you and your MP colleagues is this week. Who are you going to back?
Well, so far, I don't know who I would want out of the last two, partly because I don't know who the last two are. But so far, I've been voting to keep people in. So I voted for Mel Stride in the first round. I voted for Tom Tugendhat in the second. And this week, on Tuesday, I'll be voting for Tom Tugendhat again.
the curiosity of the Conservatives leadership contest, where people vote to keep somebody in rather than actually voting for who they want.
Approach.
It's a more positive approach. Well, Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much indeed for coming in and joining us. And it's a busy weekend all round. Right then, let's have a final word with our panel about everything that we have been talking about this morning. I think we can show you again what's happening in Beirut, or maybe we'll do that in a few moments. Let's check in with our panel as we come to a close. Zani, it was interesting to hear Malcolm Rifkin, before we were talking, say that actually he does feel a bit optimistic. Do you feel
I would so love to share that optimism. Look, I think Malcolm Rifkin, you're right, Malcolm, that when things seem darkest, there always is eventually conflicts do come to an end, and I'm very confident that eventually there will be peace in the Middle East. And so I share where you're going. However, when I hear the lady you had from Iran coming perilously close to saying that Israel had no right to exist. She started by saying the problems all started in 1948. And when you hear the Israeli ambassador basically say that a two-state solution is off the table, and indeed, if you look at public opinion right now, the Israelis, it's off the table. It's going to be really hard to get from where we are now to where we need to get. So I share the enthusiasm. We've written editorial after editorial in the past year laying out how you can get to peace in the Middle East, and it's a ceasefire, it is a path to a two-state solution. There are some reasons for optimism, and I think you're absolutely right. The fact that no Arab country has cut ties with Israel, the fact that we have the Abraham Accords, there are things to build on, but it's going to be really hard. And as this conflict widens, and as I worry that Israel under Bibi Netanyahu will become even more hubristic in Lebanon and will try and think that everything can be done by force, I think that day is further ahead than it should be.
And just for people watching this morning, you know, there are so many different strands to it, Sir Malcolm, but is it the case in your view that what's really behind this is the intense rivalry between Iran and Israel? I mean, is that really what, if we peel everything back, is that what's about?
Well, I go along with what Zane has just been saying. I was once told that a pessimist was someone who believes things couldn't be worse. An optimist was someone who knew they could be. Now, let me just give you one final short example of what I'm saying. I was in Israel for Yitzhak Rabin's funeral after his assassination. The following day, I was touring the Middle East, and I went to Gaza, and I met Yasser Arafat. And Arafat was not exactly a friend of Israel. And I'd met him once before, and he said on this occasion, we can only meet for half an hour. Why, I said? He said, because I'm being driven to Israel this afternoon to go and see Leah Rabin and pay my condolences.
The wife of the...
Now, if Yasser Arafat could go to the widow of an assassinated Israeli prime minister to pay his condolences, think of the history of both these people. That's why I'm saying when the people are right, then you begin to make progress.
Sarah, do you think there can be progress?
You have to believe in that. We can't consign the Middle East as a region that will always be seeing death, hundreds of thousands of people dying. There has to be belief that things can change. And I think the UK government, as well as the US, has a role to play in that. And so far it has failed in doing what's right by the people of the Middle East, the people of Gaza and now Lebanon, but also our own home population.
Okay, well, all three of you, it's been fascinating to have you with us this morning. I feel like we've talked about lots of different strands, but heard really interesting insights from all three of you. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Just before we leave you, we can show you again what's happening in Beirut, the Lebanese capital, which was hit again by Israel last night. I'm hoping we can show you the pictures. Yeah, you can see a pall of smoke hanging over the city after more Israeli strikes as Lebanon and the Lebanese capital and the Lebanese people increasingly become caught up in this terrible tangle. Our colleagues on the ground there in Lebanon and in Israel will bring you everything you need to know in the coming days. Our politicians here in the UK are repeatedly trying to call for calm, but there's no doubt the situation is tense and danger seems to be rising. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell for Sunday's newscast later. You can find that on BBC Sounds. And of course, I will look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.